In 612 BCE, the most powerful empire humanity had ever witnessed was wiped out in a single season. Not worn down, not cut back, erased. The capital of Assyria, Nineveh, was looted, torched, and so utterly annihilated that within just 2 generations, people doubted it had ever even been real. The Greek historian Xenophon led his troops past its ruins in 401 BCE and asked the natives what city that was. No one could answer him. An empire that had reigned from Egypt to Persia, that had created the worlds. First library that had deployed the most advanced war machine the ancient world had ever known, had been so completely obliterated that its very name was turning into legend. The Book of Nahum, composed by a prophet who saw Nineveh's destruction firsthand, records the spirit of the ancient world in just 3 words. Nineveh lies waste. But here's what makes this tale truly bizarre. The ones who demolished Nineveh were the Babylonians and the Medes. And 2 decades earlier, neither would have even considered it. The Assyrians had been the most dreaded fighting force on the planet for 300 years. So what shifted, and why? When the fall arrived, was it so absolute that even the recollection nearly faded away? To understand that, you must return to the start, to a modest settlement on the eastern shore of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq that most people, music, have never heard of. The settlement was named Ashur. Ashur was not born a warlord. For the initial millennium of its life, it functioned as a commercial hub. Assyrian traders had set up outposts as distant as Anatolia in present-day Turkey. By 1900 BCE, the clay records they left behind, the so-called Cappadocian tablets, stand as the most ancient trade documents ever uncovered. Correspondence among dealers, agreements, grievances over deliveries that arrived behind schedule. A society founded not on battle, but on business. There is something valuable, worth pausing over here. The Cappadocian tablets, those old trader correspondences, are not the chronicles of a mighty nation proclaiming its arrival to posterity. They are grievances. One clay tablet from roughly 1900 BCE comes from a dealer called Nani, enraged at a business partner who supplied him with substandard copper. It is arguably the oldest surviving written grievance in history. The Assyrians first appear in the record not as fighters, but as folks frustrated that their deliveries were faulty. That is a far more relatable origin than most empires receive. What transformed Ashur was what always transforms small states: the fall of their neighbors. In the 1300s BCE, the powerful Mitanni kingdom that had ruled northern Mesopotamia began to crumble under pressure from the Hittites in the west. Assyria had served as a Mitanni vassal for generations. When Mitanni weakened, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal did something unprecedented. He began dispatching letters to the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten on equal footing, not as a subordinate, not as a tribute payer, as a fellow monarch. Akhenaten's court, accustomed to corresponding only with major powers, reportedly considered this arrogant. They were about to learn otherwise. Over the next 300 years, the Assyrians expanded, sometimes offensively, sometimes defensively, almost always successfully. They built an army that was, for its era, unmatched. Iron weapons when others still used bronze. Cavalry when most forces still relied on chariots. Siege engines that could breach walls previously thought impenetrable. And something more, something that distinguished them from every empire before them: terror of statecraft. The Assyrian kings did not merely seize land. They chronicled their campaigns in painstaking detail on stone panels that decorated their palace walls. And what they recorded were not diplomatic triumphs. They were the horrors inflicted on those who resisted. King Ashurbanipal II, who reigned from 883 to 859 BCE, left inscriptions that read with a clinical precision still jarring today. He described skinning captured leaders alive and stretching their hides over city gates, impaling prisoners on stakes outside conquered towns, severing hands and noses and piling them in mounds. He recorded these acts not with remorse but with boasting. They were designed to be seen. They were designed to be disseminated. It was propaganda, and it worked. The palace reliefs of Ashurbanipal II now reside in the British Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Visitors pass by them. School children on tours shuffle before them. They are masterpieces of craftsmanship, carved with a skill and exactness that would not be surpassed in European sculpture for another 15 centuries. And they depict in graphic detail what the Assyrian army inflicted on those who defied them. They were not concealed in rear chambers. They adorned the primary corridors of the palace where guests, envoys, and tribute-bringing monarchs would have been led. The signal was intentional. Observe what we do. Choose whether you wish to oppose us. Within a single generation, cities were yielding to Assyrian forces before they even arrived. The reputation accomplished what troops would otherwise have had to do. But here's what most histories of Assyria overlook. This was not mindless brutality. It was deliberate calculus. The Assyrians analyzed the challenge of governing an empire, and they determined that the greatest danger to any empire was the expense of suppressing uprisings. Whenever a conquered people rebelled, you had to dispatch an army, wage a campaign, rebuild authority, and begin again. It was costly and it was sluggish. The answer they crafted was to render the price of insurrection so visibly catastrophic that revolt would not be attempted. Terror was more economical than occupation, and the strategy succeeded for 2 centuries. But it was not their only approach. The other approach is what surprises those who know Assyria only as conquerors. It was relocation. And relocation in the Assyrian system was not exactly what it seems. When Tiglath-Pileser III ascended to the throne in 745 BC, the empire was in crisis. A line of ineffective rulers had allowed the frontiers to shrink, and 2 devastating plague outbreaks had crippled the agricultural base of the Assyrian homeland. He responded with a restructuring of the empire so sweeping that historians often regard him as its true architect. He established the world's first permanent professional army. Soldiers who trained throughout the year received fixed wages and were not required to return home for harvest season. He reorganized the provinces, substituting local chieftains with Assyrian administrators who answered directly to the throne. And he systematized mass deportation on a scale never before attempted. In a single year, according to his own records, 154,000 individuals were forcibly moved across the empire. But the specifics of how this was executed are significant. The deported were not executed. They were not enslaved in the traditional sense. They were relocated with their families intact. They were provided with food, clothing, and footwear for the journey, as recorded in a letter from an Assyrian official to the monarch. Upon arrival, they became Assyrian citizens with the same legal standing as the native inhabitants. Those selected for relocation were specifically the urban elites, artisans, and specialists. The individuals whose knowledge and abilities were most prized. What the Assyrians were practicing was not ethnic cleansing. It was something more unusual. They were constructing the world's first multicultural knowledge economy, consolidating human talent from across the subjugated territories into the imperial core. This brings us to the ruler who stood at the summit of this entire system, and the contradiction at the center of his narrative. Ashurbanipal assumed the throne in 668 BCE. He was never meant to be king. He had an elder brother who was the appointed successor, and Ashurbanipal had been prepared for a different path, one of learning. He had been taught to read and write, which was highly uncommon for a monarch. He had studied mathematics, astronomy, and divination when his brother died, and he unexpectedly inherited the throne of the greatest empire on earth. He carried that intellectual disposition with him. His military achievements were imposing. He conquered Egypt, crushed uprisings throughout the realm, and waged campaigns against Elam to the east so destructive that the ancient city of Susa was sown with salt so nothing would ever flourish there again. His own inscriptions boast of it. He was, by every conventional standard, a conqueror in the Assyrian mold. But within his palace at Nineveh, he was constructing something unprecedented. He dispatched agents across the empire with fixed orders to gather writings. Every tablet in every temple, palace, and scribal academy was to be duplicated and forwarded to Nineveh. Scholars were brought to the capital and given designated spaces to labor. When he plundered Babylon during an uprising, his forces carried off not only precious metals, but thousands of clay tablets from the sanctuaries and archives. When he destroyed Susa, among the items inventoried and transported north were tablets, so ancient that the scribes in Nineveh required specialized sign lists merely to interpret them. The library he amassed contained over 30,000 tablets, medical treatises, astronomical records, mathematical computations, and the mythological and literary works that had been accumulating in Mesopotamia for 2 millennia. And at the conclusion of each tablet, his scribes appended a colophon, a type of ownership inscription that read, "For the sake of distant days." He was not merely collecting knowledge for himself. He understood that he was safeguarding it for a future he would not witness. There's a letter in the British Museum from Ashurbanipal himself, written in his own hand, which is exceedingly rare for an ancient ruler. In it, he describes his passion for scholarship. He writes of solving intricate mathematical problems and of reading inscriptions in Sumerian, a dead language even then, the equivalent of a modern monarch reading Linear B. He took pride in this. It was not a pastime. It was, he believed, integral to his fitness to rule. A king who grasped the past could navigate the present. He inscribed his name on thousands of tablets, not to claim glory, but to ensure their survival. Tablets belonging to the palace of Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Assyria, he wrote repeatedly. A man striving to secure himself in posterity. The supreme irony is that he was correct to fear for the future, just not for the reasons he imagined. Ashurbanipal's reign marked the zenith of the Assyrian Empire. It was also the commencement of its decline, and the cause was something no military triumph could remedy. The empire had simply grown too vast for the system that sustained it. The Assyrian model demanded perpetual expansion. Every year, the army campaigned. Every year, fresh tribute flowed into the capital. Every year, the provinces had to be policed by governors backed by armed force. When expansion slowed, the revenue slowed with it. When the army was occupied, suppressing revolts in multiple provinces simultaneously, it could not expand. And when the army could not expand, the economic foundation of the empire began to unravel. The climate aggravated matters. Research published in Science Advances has demonstrated that the Assyrian heartland experienced nearly 2 centuries of unusually high rainfall that supported an agricultural boom and enabled the population growth that made the empire viable. In the 7th century BCE, that rainfall pattern shifted. Megadroughts struck the region, not for years, but for decades. Harvests collapsed, grain reserves ran dry. An empire that had sustained itself on the abundance of favorable weather was now attempting to uphold its military obligations on a failing one. And then the succession crisis arrived. Ashurbanipal's lengthy reign created a dilemma he could not resolve. He had multiple sons, and when he died around 631 BCE, they turned on each other. The empire did not collapse gradually. It shattered. Fratricidal warfare between rival heirs pulled the military in conflicting directions at once. The Babylonians, who had chafed under Assyrian domination for generations, recognized their opportunity. They forged an alliance with the Medes and Iranian peoples from the east, who had their own grievances against Assyria. Together, they advanced on Nineveh. The city fell in 612 BCE. The annihilation was, by every ancient account, absolute. The Assyrian monarch perished in the blazing palace. The populace was slaughtered or dispersed. The city was not merely captured, it was obliterated from the landscape. Other Assyrian strongholds collapsed in the years that followed. And by 605 BCE, the final vestiges of Assyrian resistance had been stamped out. Those who destroyed Nineveh were unambiguous about their motives. These were not rivals incorporating a great power into their own dominion. These were subjugated peoples exacting retribution. Every city the Assyrians had ever razed, every population they had ever displaced, every ruler they had ever skinned and suspended from city wall, all of it returned in the form of adversaries who were not content merely to defeat Assyria. They were determined to ensure it could never rise again. That is why, when Xenophon marched past the ruins less than 2 centuries later, no one could identify the city. The modern city of Mosul in northern Iraq sits today roughly across the Tigris from the ruins of Nineveh. The tablets from Ashurbanipal's library now reside in the British Museum, where they were taken following excavations in the 1850s. Among them is the oldest surviving copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale about a ruler who seeks immortality and fails. Composed by people who had been dead for 2 millennia by the time the British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard unearthed it from the ground. When George Smith, a young banknote engraver who studied the tablets during his lunch breaks at the British Museum, deciphered one of them in 1872 and discovered a flood narrative almost identical to the story of Noah, he reportedly rose from his desk and began tearing off his clothes in excitement. He had just realized that the biblical flood account was not original. It had been borrowed from civilization so ancient that its very existence had been forgotten. That is the legacy of Assyria. Not the empire, not the terror, not even the library, though the library was extraordinary. The legacy is that through that library, knowledge survived that would otherwise have been lost forever. The Assyrian king who sowed salt in the soil of his enemies also preserved the wisdom of civilizations that preceded him. And the fire that consumed his palace in 612 BC, the blaze his enemies set to wipe him from memory, baked his clay tablets harder and preserved them for the next 2,500 years. Ashurbanipal wrote for the sake of distant days. He had no idea how distant those days would be, or that we would still be reading them.